Hello everybody. So today we're going to be doing an online module because I am away at the conference in Virginia. And this module is going to be all about test bias. The chapter I had you read in our textbook, it talks a little bit about bias, but I feel like as our classrooms become more and more diverse, and the textbook publishing companies do not, that it's important that we spend a little more time on this idea of test bias. So when I talk about test bias, really what I'm talking about is, does the assessment measure what it intends to measure? And that's really the validity of the assessment. So this is Salt and Pepper, and they're going to help us talk about test bias. So the definition of test bias is the presence of one or more items in a test that offend or unfairly penalize students because of students' personal characteristics. And sometimes that's hard for us to understand, so I have a video here for you to watch.
This video was created to help teachers prevent cultural bias in their tests and is not meant to criticize any teachers or teaching methods. Cultural bias is favoring one person over another due to their ethnicity or socioeconomic background. In the classroom, this bias is mostly seen in testing, where it is the most harmful. Cultural bias can damage a student's motivation, self-esteem, and academic achievement. There are several things a teacher can do to get a fair and equal assessment of all their students. Try to avoid using any cultural references. Assumption is the biggest factor in creating biased test questions. An example of a biased test question would be, Harvard is to crimson as Yale is to blank, the correct answer being blue. This test question is culturally biased, ethnically and socioeconomically. A student not born in the United States may have never heard of these schools, and a student from an impoverished family may have never learned anything about these expensive universities. Using cultural references assesses knowledge gained at home rather than knowledge gained at school, which creates an unfair test. Another example would be, if a fruit contains seeds, which of the following is not a fruit? The correct answer is celery, and though to some this seems obvious, to others who cannot afford fresh fruit or have never had the experience of carving a pumpkin at Halloween, this question becomes excessively difficult. Because it is very difficult to prevent all cultural references and completely eliminate cultural bias, some things that can be done before a test to help would be ensuring students have had exposure to the experiences assumed in the test. In this case, being sure that all students have seen and handled the foods mentioned in the previous question. Another thing to do to help would be ensuring students were given the opportunity to develop the prerequisite skills. For instance, being sure that a student knows all the vocabulary mentioned in a test where vocabulary is not the assessment. And finally, teachers can ensure that their students have experience or instruction in taking certain types of tests. For example, explaining what a multiple choice test is before giving it, or explaining how students will be graded on their tests. Furthering your understanding of poverty and other people's culture can help you prevent being subconsciously biased in the classroom. Also, becoming aware of your own culture and understanding it helps. Now that you have a better understanding of cultural bias, I hope that you will be inclined to further research it and share your knowledge with your colleagues, and that your classroom will be less culturally biased and become a more fair and equal teaching environment. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. So let's go on with now analyzing some of the largest common sources of bias in assessment. There are three biggies, so to speak. There's racial and ethnic bias, gender bias, which is male or female, and then socioeconomic bias, which is your economic status, if you're poor or wealthy. So those are the three that we're going to really focus on with this next activity. I'm going to ask you to analyze some test questions, and it's always easier if you have sort of a guide. And this judgmental bias detection strategies worksheet is sort of a guide to look at things, literature, test questions, media, anything at all, and think about, is there bias here? So there's 5 kinds of bias. There's a content bias, language bias. Is it offensive? Is it a stereotype? And does it permit inclusion of diversity? Not is it just not offensive, but is there an inclusion of diversity as well? Okay, so these are the 5 components that you'll use to analyze a test question for bias. And you'll notice here that the detection strategies ask you questions. So that sort of gives you the prompt to look at it and figure out which kind of bias you'll see. So I have pulled 6 multiple choice test samples for you to analyze. You won't be able to click on this link because this is going to be a YouTube video. So I'm going to click on it, but you will find this PDF in the lesson book or in the lesson module. Okay? You're going to look at each question and analyze it for bias. The 2 questions that I ask you to look for is what kind of bias is demonstrated in the test item, and that would be content, language, is it offensive, are there stereotypes, and do they include diversity, or is there no diversity and inclusion at all? And then the second question I ask you is, so prove it to me. What specific details support your conclusions? And again, you'll use the judgmental bias detection strategies, and this time you're going to use the content here to back up what kind of bias you notice in the test question. When you are finished, you will upload your document to the As You Learn link, and you'll be all set. So let's just do one together. Okay, so here's the first one. It says in small groups, but you're not going to be doing this in small groups. When we meet face-to-face, usually you'll do this activity in small groups, but I'm asking you to do it on your own. So here's a test item, and here you can see where I'm asking you what kind of bias is demonstrated, what are your details, and then it says here share with the class. But we're not meeting face-to-face, so you're not going to share this with the class. You're going to just write it on the document, or create your own document and write it on there. So make sure that you number your questions. This is test item 1, 2, 3, and you can tell by the page number, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so there are 6 of them there. And for all of these, you're going to answer the same questions. What kind of bias is it? And what are your details to back up your conclusion? Okay, so when you're finished, you'll upload that to As You Learn and you'll be finished. Please contact me if you have any questions. I think you guys got this pretty much handled.